cadence labels. So you may remember from last year that you learned 3 basic types of cadences, and those were perfect authentic, imperfect authentic, and half cadence. You talked about a few others as well, but I'm going to get to those later in this video. A perfect authentic cadence is a cadence that uses the chord 5 moving to the chord 1, but it needs a few other criteria in order to be perfect. Namely, last year you learned that the soprano note had to land on scale degree 1 in order to be a perfect cadence, and you probably also learned that both chords had to be in root position. We're going to modify that slightly for this year. So rather than saying that the soprano has to land on scale degree 1, we're going to say that the lead melodic voice needs to land on scale degree 1. Why is that the case? Well, because we're going to take a look at music this year where the soprano is not necessarily the melody. Orchestral music, for example, string quartets, and a variety of other forms. Imperfect authentic also has the progression 5 moving to 1, but basically if any of the other criteria are broken, that's when it becomes imperfect. So for example, if your melody is on a note that is not scale degree 1, scale degree 3 or scale degree 5, for example, or if either of your chords is inverted, then it automatically becomes an imperfect authentic cadence. I'm going to really emphasize here that just using the term authentic cadence, that's not going to be a valid answer in this class, and I will mark it wrong. Seems like maybe I'm being a little bit too fussy about that, but there's a very specific reason for it. And the reason is that whether a cadence is perfect or imperfect is actually going to impact how we hear whether a phrase is ending, for example, or whether something is coming to a climax or a peak of some kind. So that's important information for us to be able to determine other things about the passage of music that we're looking at. The other most common kind of cadence is half cadence. And this is called half cadence because it basically takes a perfect or an imperfect cadence and chops it in half and gets rid of the second half. So rather than going 5-1, it just goes 5. There's a common misconception with half cadences that they're always 1 moving to 5, but that's actually one of the least common forms of creating a half cadence. Half cadences are more commonly a 2 chord moving to a 5 chord or a 4 chord moving to 5 chord. By via their definition, they can actually be any chord moving to a 5 chord. So I'm going to call that X to 5 when I'm referring to the progression in this class. In other words, anything terminating with a 5 chord. You also may have learned in previous classes that half cadences have to be triads rather than 7th chords, and it turns out that that's not entirely true. There are situations where we can have a 7th attached to a half cadence. The reason that you're told in other courses that this isn't the case is because it's actually pretty rare. The 7th of the chord wants to resolve, and so it creates more of a connection than we would typically expect with a cadence, which is typically supposed to be an ending point of some kind. That actually provides me with a good place to jump in with what exactly a cadence is. A cadence is essentially a point of musical punctuation. And for the purposes of what we're doing in this course, Music 292, we're going to understand cadences as essentially being things that articulate phrase endings. There are exceptions to that, and we're going to talk about that particularly when we get into the second half of this course. But from just a basic definition perspective, we can think of it as a point of musical punctuation, typically bringing our phrase to a close. Now you're probably wondering, well, Dr. Lind, you've left out 2 different kinds of cadences that we've learned about before, the deceptive cadence and the plagal cadence. Well, it turns out I'm actually going to treat those 2 cadences quite a bit differently this year. And the reason for that is they don't function the same way within phrase structure as the other 3 kinds of cadences do. Perfect authentic, imperfect authentic, and half cadences typically act to end phrases. Deceptive and plagals do not. Deceptive cadences are typically moments of evaded cadence. So it's set up as if it should be a cadence, but then it doesn't end the way that we expect it to. We're going to actually talk about this pretty extensively in Unit 7 of this course, when we talk about phrase deviations. Plagal cadences, the way that I'm understanding cadences for this course, actually aren't really cadences at all. They're essentially what are called extensions. They're ways of taking the ending of your phrase and stretching it out a little bit longer. So I'm actually not going to use the term cadence to describe this kind of motion. So basically, for the purposes of this year, erase the plagal cadence from your mind. It does not exist. Once again, we will talk about that in Unit 7, and we'll talk about how that's an extension of a phrase ending. The very last thing that I would like to talk about in this video are cadential 6/4s. I'll do a breakdown of them in a separate video in terms of how to build them, but I just want to say in terms of cadences, they're one of the strongest signals that you actually have a cadence happening. That is why they are literally called cadential 6/4. In other words, a 6/4, that is part of a cadence. So if you're seeing a cadential 6/4, you can assume that 9 times out of 10, it's also going to create a cadence, and you should therefore label that. There's your cadence review. I'll see you in the next video.